In the autumn of 1798, 17 travelers vanished without a trace along a 20-mile stretch of wilderness road in southeastern Kentucky. Their horses were found abandoned, their belongings scattered, but there was no sign of struggle, no clues to their fate. What made these disappearances even more chilling wasn't just their number, but the shocking secrecy that followed. Local authorities buried every record of the investigation, and for over 200 years, the truth about the Harden family farm remained hidden. But in 1987, a forgotten set of court documents was uncovered, documents that would reveal one of the most disturbing cases of organized murder in early American history. A murder spree so meticulously planned, so perfectly disguised as Christian charity, it went unnoticed for 8 years. Imagine a family, widely respected in their small town, offering assistance to anyone in need. They were seen as pillars of the community, always helping travelers with broken wagons, offering shelter to the lost and weary. But behind their well-maintained facade, a twisted agenda was unfolding. A family that gained the trust of countless travelers, only to betray them with ruthless efficiency. Before we dive into the chilling details of the Harden family's crimes, ask yourself this. How many seemingly perfect families are hiding dark secrets? Are you ready to uncover the truth that powerful families tried to keep buried for centuries? Stay with us as we unravel the terrifying story that remained hidden in the shadows of Kentucky for far too long. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell, because what we're about to reveal will send shivers down your spine. Southeastern Kentucky in 1798 was a land caught between civilization and wilderness. Settlers, lured by the promise of fertile soil and new beginnings, made their way along the Wilderness Road, one of the most dangerous and vital routes in America at the time. Carved through the Cumberland Gap by Daniel Boone, this narrow, winding path stretched for over 200 miles, cutting through the dense forests and rugged terrain of the Appalachian Mountains. For those who ventured along it, the road promised both opportunity and peril, and for many, it would be their final journey. As pioneers poured westward, seeking land, riches, or simply a fresh start, they had little choice but to trust the sparse settlements along the way for shelter, food, and guidance. These small towns were lifelines, offering refuge from the dangers that lurked in the wilderness: wild animals, treacherous weather, and, as many would soon learn, even worse threats. At the heart of the sprawling wilderness lay Millfield, a small but critical town located at a sharp bend along the Wilderness Road. With barely 300 residents, Millfield was a tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone, or thought they did. Established in 1794 by a group of Virginia Baptists seeking religious freedom, Millfield was a place where morality and religion were woven into every aspect of daily life. The town's social fabric was shaped by the unwavering authority of its religious leaders, and Sunday services were not just a tradition, but a requirement. It was a place where law, order, and faith governed the lives of its inhabitants. Millfield's reputation for piety and hard work made it a beacon for other settlers moving west. But what many didn't know was that lurking just outside the town, hidden among the thick forests of Beaver Creek, was a family whose dark secret would go unnoticed for years. The Hardens, Ezekiel and his wife Temperance, along with their 3 children, Caleb, Josiah, and Mercy, arrived in Millfield in 1791, claiming to have fled brutal Indian raids in eastern Virginia. The community welcomed them with open arms, and the family quickly became trusted figures in town life. Ezekiel, a towering figure known for his booming voice and fiery sermons, was seen as a spiritual leader among the settlers. Temperance, a delicate woman with a deep knowledge of medicinal herbs, was revered as the town's healer. Together, they presented themselves as selfless, hardworking, and deeply religious. The Harden's farm, which sprawled across 400 acres along Beaver Creek, quickly became a vital resource for the growing community, and their reputation for hospitality spread far and wide. But in a land where death was never far away and survival was a daily battle, appearances were often deceiving. Beneath the Hardens' respectable facade, a chilling operation was quietly taking shape, one that would result in the disappearance of countless travelers and the building of a gruesome legacy that would remain hidden for over 2 centuries. Millfield, a town that prided itself on its moral code and community values, was about to learn just how easily evil can hide behind a mask of righteousness. The Harden family appeared to be everything a frontier settlement could hope for: strong, devoted, and deeply rooted in the religious and moral values of the time. When Ezekiel Harden and his wife Temperance arrived in Millfield in 1791, they were welcomed with open arms, their tragic backstory of fleeing from brutal Indian raids in eastern Virginia lending them an air of sympathy and respectability. But the Hardens weren't just survivors. They were soon seen as pillars of the community, offering help to those in need, ministering to the sick, and providing a steady hand in times of crisis. Ezekiel Harden, the patriarch, stood at the center of the family. A man of imposing stature, well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a deep voice that carried authority wherever he went, Ezekiel quickly gained the respect of the settlers. His sermons were filled with passion and fire, and he spoke with a conviction that moved many in the congregation to tears. There was something undeniably powerful about him, a commanding presence that made other men step aside when he entered a room. Those who heard him preach often remarked that he seemed to speak with the authority of someone who had personally witnessed both heaven and hell. His words were a mixture of compassion and harsh judgment, and while some found comfort in his sermons, others found themselves unsettled by his emphasis on divine wrath and retribution. Ezekiel was a lay preacher, stepping in to assist the Reverend Ephraim Cole at the New Jerusalem Baptist Church, the spiritual heart of Millfield. His presence in the town wasn't just limited to religious matters. However, he took on leadership roles in the community, always positioning himself as the one who could offer guidance and wisdom in times of need. And yet, despite his strong moral convictions, there were whispers about his methods. His authoritarian approach to both religion and community life made some uncomfortable. But in a time when survival was a daily struggle and strong leadership was valued, few questioned Ezekiel's authority. His wife, Temperance Harden, was equally impressive, though in a different way. A small, delicate woman with prematurely gray hair, she was known throughout Millfield for her knowledge of herbal remedies and her skills as a healer. Temperance had an almost mystical reputation in the town. Her touch seemed to heal broken bones, cure fevers, and ease the pain of childbirth. Her knowledge of medicinal herbs was encyclopedic, and she was called upon in times of crisis when others had no answer. Many residents, particularly those who were ill or injured, credited Temperance with saving their lives. She was a woman whose quiet demeanor and compassionate nature masked a hidden strength, and no one suspected her of anything other than kindness and devotion to her family and community. Their 3 children, Caleb, Josiah, and Mercy, were the picture of frontier virtue. Caleb, the eldest son at 26, took after his father in both stature and strength. He was a hard-working man, tirelessly working the family farm and offering help to elderly neighbors. He was seen as dependable and trustworthy, the kind of man who could be counted on to lend a hand in times of need. While Caleb had his father's imposing physical presence, he also shared his mother's gentle demeanor, always willing to stop and listen to those in need. Josiah, at 24, was smaller in stature but no less integral to the family. He was a quiet, intellectual man who often found himself serving as the town's unofficial schoolmaster during the winter months when farm work slowed down. Josiah's love for books and learning made him a respected figure, especially among those who valued education in an otherwise harsh and unrefined frontier. He had a sharp mind and a curiosity that extended beyond practical farming skills. He had a desire to understand the world and its mysteries, a trait that would later prove unsettling in the context of the family's actions. At just 22, Mercy was considered one of the most beautiful women in the county, with her sweet disposition making her popular among both men and women alike. Mercy's charm and grace were unparalleled, and she quickly became known for her beauty and kindness. She helped with the family's charitable work, attending to the sick and injured, and she was often the face of the Harden family's hospitality. She had a way of making visitors feel at ease, as if they had been welcomed into the home of old friends. Yet, beneath her exterior of sweetness and charm, Mercy was also a quiet observer. Her role in the family would later become critical when the truth about the Hardens' dark secret was finally revealed. The Harden farm, sprawling across 400 acres of fertile land along Beaver Creek, was the heart of the family's prosperity. The land had cost Ezekiel nearly every penny he possessed, but it was a wise investment. The rich soil yielded abundant crops of corn and tobacco, while the creek provided water for livestock and powered a small grist mill that served the surrounding community. The Hardens' wealth seemed to come from nowhere, and the prosperity of their farm was noted by many, but no one questioned where it came from. They had more than what could be explained by farming alone, and that disparity would come under scrutiny as the story unfolded. Ezekiel had carefully crafted his homestead to reflect his status and security. The main house was a two-story log structure, far more luxurious than most frontier homes, with stone chimneys and glass windows, an uncommon luxury in the frontier. Inside, the rooms were furnished with imported goods and fine china, a stark contrast to the rough, utilitarian houses most families built. This house, which should have stood as a symbol of the Hardens' hard work, would later be remembered for what it hid beneath its walls. The Harden family seemed perfect, a model of frontier virtue. Their good deeds were well known, and their home was a sanctuary for travelers in need. But behind their warmth and generosity lay a hidden darkness. The family's success wasn't solely due to hard work. It was the result of something far more sinister, something that, for years, the residents of Millfield couldn't even begin to imagine. The first signs that something was terribly wrong came on October 13, 1798. Samuel Fletcher, an experienced merchant, failed to arrive in Lexington as scheduled, despite being one of the most punctual travelers along the Wilderness Road. Fletcher had been making the journey between Virginia and Kentucky for 12 years, and his reliability was well known. He had a reputation for being prompt, and when he was late, it was highly unusual. His business partner, Thomas Greeley, grew immediately concerned. Greeley knew Fletcher well enough to understand that there was no way he would miss an important delivery without notifying him first. The two men had worked together for years, building a trusted partnership that had allowed their business to thrive. So when 5 days passed without a word, Greeley knew something catastrophic had happened. He immediately set out to retrace Fletcher's steps, starting from Lexington and following the well-worn path he had taken year after year. By October 18th, Greeley had reached Millfield, a small town that sat along the route Fletcher would have traveled. At first, there were no signs of foul play. Greeley spoke with locals, including the innkeepers and merchants, and each one confirmed that Fletcher had passed through the town on time, just as expected. However, once Greeley reached the outskirts of Millfield, his search took an eerie turn. It was near Miller's Creek that Greeley found a clue that would haunt him for years to come. Fletcher's horse, grazing by the side of the road. The bay mare was still saddled, its reins hanging loosely beside it. There was no sign of the merchant, but the animal appeared well-fed, calm, and cared for, not at all like a creature that had been abandoned in a hurry. The horse's bridle had been removed and hung carefully on a nearby tree branch, a peculiar detail that made it seem as though someone had intentionally unstrapped the horse before leaving it behind. Even more unsettling was the discovery of Fletcher's saddlebags, which had been left intact and untouched. Among the contents was a leather pouch containing nearly $50 in silver coins, a considerable sum for the time. The money's presence ruled out robbery, as it was unlikely that a thief would leave behind such a valuable item. And yet, there was no sign of Fletcher, no trail leading away from the horse, and no explanation for where he had gone. Greeley's gut told him that this wasn't just an accident. Something far darker had occurred. He immediately informed the local authorities, and Constable Jacob Winters was tasked with leading the investigation. Winters, a former soldier with experience fighting in the Ohio campaigns, had seen his share of violence and deception. He knew that frontier life could be brutal, and disappearances were not uncommon. But Fletcher's case struck him as different. There were no signs of struggle, no traces of blood, and no evidence of a wild animal attack. It was as though Fletcher had simply vanished into thin air. The search party that Winters organized began at the site where Greeley had discovered Fletcher's horse. It didn't take long for the group to follow a trail, a faint but discernible path that led toward the Harden family farm. The trail was marked by torn fabric caught on thorns and occasional drops of what appeared to be blood. The searchers assumed that Fletcher had been injured, but why had he wandered off the road and into the wilderness, leaving no signs of a struggle? Why had the trail ended abruptly at the Harden property? Winters was no stranger to disappearances, But something about Fletcher's case made him uneasy. He had been a constable long enough to know that the most obvious explanations were often the wrong ones. He led his search party to the Harden farm, but when they arrived, they found nothing, no signs of disturbance, no evidence of a confrontation. It was as though Fletcher had never been there at all. Winters spoke with Ezekiel Harden, who readily admitted that Fletcher had stopped by the farm on October 13th. According to Ezekiel, Fletcher had been in a hurry, asking for directions to a shortcut that would save him a day of travel. Ezekiel had warned him about the dangers of unfamiliar routes, especially with winter weather approaching. Despite the warnings, Fletcher had insisted on pressing forward and declined their offer of a warm meal or a bed for the night. According to Ezekiel, the merchant had seemed nervous, but had said little about his apparent anxiety. The story seemed plausible at first. It fit with the kind of behavior one might expect from a seasoned traveler who had grown accustomed to taking risks. But there was something off about the details. Every member of the Harden family corroborated Ezekiel's account, repeating the exact same details in unison. They all remembered Fletcher's hasty departure, his nervousness, even the specific words he had used when declining their hospitality. The consistency of their testimony should have been reassuring, but to Winters it felt rehearsed, too perfect, too coordinated. Real witnesses often contradict each other on small points, but the Harden family's version of events was flawless. Winters couldn't shake the feeling that something was being hidden. As the investigation continued, more unsettling details emerged. Changes had been made to the layout of the Harden farm. New outbuildings had been constructed, including an unusually large smokehouse and what appeared to be an enlarged root cellar. These improvements were said to be the result of a successful harvest, but Winters found it strange that the Hardens would need such extensive facilities for a small farm. The new smokehouse, in particular, raised questions. It seemed far too large for their personal use and was built with thick stone walls, suggesting it was meant for something other than food preservation. Still, there was no solid evidence linking the Hardens to Fletcher's disappearance, and without proof, there was little Winters could do. The case was officially recorded as a probable robbery or Indian attack, and Fletcher's disappearance was added to the growing list of mysterious frontier casualties. But Winters wasn't convinced. He couldn't shake the sense that the Harden family was hiding something far more sinister than simple bad luck. As the months passed, the disappearances continued with terrifying regularity. Each new case seemed to follow the same pattern, travelers vanishing without a trace, their horses abandoned, and their belongings scattered in eerie similarity to the last. The trail always led toward the Harden family farm, and yet, each time the local authorities questioned the Hardens, they found the same story. The family had seen the travelers, offered advice, and then watched them leave, often in a hurry, but without incident. Constable Jacob Winters found himself growing more and more frustrated. He had seen his share of strange happenings in the frontier, but the number of missing travelers in such a concentrated area was simply too much to ignore. Something didn't add up, and his instincts told him that the Harden family was somehow involved. Winters was no stranger to the harsh realities of frontier life, where disappearances were often chalked up to accidents, wild animals, or Indian attacks. But the increasing frequency of these incidents, combined with the bizarre consistency of the circumstances, led him to suspect something far more sinister. He began to quietly gather evidence, carefully interviewing other locals and studying the patterns of the disappearances. It didn't take long for him to see the connection. Each victim had been seen asking for directions to the Harden farm or had been spotted near it shortly before they vanished. It was clear that the disappearances weren't random. The Hardens' farm had become a nexus of mystery, and Winters believed that the key to solving the case lay in uncovering what was happening there. In the winter of 1799, a breakthrough came. Dr. Marcus Cromwell, a traveling physician, disappeared during his journey from Richmond to Louisville. The 43-year-old doctor had been carrying a valuable medical kit, worth over $300, along with his life's work in books and supplies. When his wagon was found overturned near Devil's Fork, 3 miles from the Harden farm, authorities assumed it was an accident. The wreckage seemed to support that theory, with Cromwell's medical instruments scattered around but his bag, containing his most valuable tools, missing. This detail raised an alarm for Winters. No wild animal would have taken such specific items, and common thieves would have been more interested in the silver and trade goods that were left untouched. It was a clue, one that pointed him back to the Hardens. Winters began revisiting the Harden farm with renewed suspicion, though the family maintained their welcoming facade. Ezekiel Harden explained that Cromwell had been seeking shelter, but the story was eerily similar to the others. The doctor had been in a hurry to continue his journey, despite offers of food and a bed. The family's consistent responses seemed rehearsed, like they were trying to avoid answering too many questions. At this point, Winters began to look more closely at the Hardens' property. The changes in the farm's layout were subtle but troubling. A new smokehouse had been built near the barn, and it was unusually large for a family farm. The outbuildings had been rearranged, and there was fresh earth around several of them, as if new foundations had been dug recently. Even more concerning, the root cellar had been enlarged, and the entrance now appeared large enough to accommodate a wagon. This raised serious questions. What kind of farm required a root cellar that large? Winters knew from experience that farmers did not need such extensive storage unless they were hiding something far more disturbing than surplus vegetables. The timing of these changes, coinciding with the rising number of disappearances, was enough to spark his suspicions. Yet Winters couldn't act on his gut feelings alone. He needed concrete evidence to bring charges against the Hardens, but every time he asked questions, he was met with polite cooperation. The Hardens were respected members of the community, and no one wanted to believe that they could be involved in such heinous crimes. But the mounting evidence suggested otherwise. Winters began to document every discrepancy, every strange detail that didn't quite add up. Meanwhile, the disappearances continued, each one more puzzling than the last. In December, the Henley family, Jonathan, his wife Elizabeth, and their 2 children vanished during one of the worst blizzards in recent memory. Their wagon had become stuck in a snowdrift just half a mile from the Harden farm, but despite extensive searches, their bodies were never found. However, their wagon was discovered a week after the storm, cleaned of snow and left beside the road. The family's personal belongings were gone, but their food supplies and tools remained untouched. What was most troubling was the evidence of human intervention. Tracks around the wagon suggested that multiple people had worked together to free the vehicle from the snowdrift. This was no ordinary accident. It looked like someone had gone to great lengths to cover up a crime. Yet, when questioned, Ezekiel Harden insisted that the Henley family had never reached his farm. He claimed they must have become lost in the storm and perished somewhere in the wilderness, but the lack of their bodies seemed to contradict that explanation. The case of Reverend Nathan Cross, a circuit preacher carrying donations for a new church in Frankfurt, added another layer of mystery. Cross, known for his powerful sermons and his fearless travels, disappeared in January 1799. His horse was found 3 days later, still carrying saddlebags containing nearly $200 in church donations. The money's presence ruled out robbery, but it raised more questions. Why would a preacher, someone who had survived so many dangers on the frontier, vanish without a trace? All these events pointed to the same conclusion. The Harden family was somehow connected to the disappearances. Yet, each time Winters confronted them, they maintained their innocence. They were always helpful, offering explanations that seemed reasonable at the time. But something about their cooperation felt too perfect, too rehearsed. As the investigation progressed, Winters realized that he was trapped in an impossible situation. The Hardens had built a reputation that made it nearly impossible for anyone to suspect them. They were pillars of the community, and accusing them of such heinous crimes could destroy not only their lives but the very fabric of Millfield itself. But Winters couldn't ignore the mounting evidence, and as the disappearances continued, he knew he was running out of time to stop the next victim from becoming just another statistic. By the spring of 1799, Constable Jacob Winters had accumulated a growing mountain of evidence against the Harden family. Yet, despite his suspicions, he lacked the one thing that would bring the case to a close: a confession. Every attempt to gather concrete proof had been thwarted by the family's well-rehearsed stories, their unyielding respectability, and the seemingly perfect alibis they presented. Winters had come to a devastating conclusion. The Hardens were masters of deception, and they had built their lives on lies. But the truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how deep it was buried. It was late one night in May 1799 when Winters received an unexpected visitor. The knock on his cabin door was soft but insistent. When he opened it, standing before him was Mercy Harden, the youngest of the Harden children, her face pale and her hands trembling. Her usually composed demeanor was gone, replaced by a raw, visible fear. For a moment, Winters simply stared at her, uncertain. Mercy had always been the picture of grace and kindness. She was the last person he had ever expected to see at his door, especially given the family's history of cooperation with the authorities. But the look in her eyes was unmistakable. Something was terribly wrong. "I need to speak with you," Mercy said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her words were urgent, but there was an edge of terror in them that made Winter's heart race. I can't live with it anymore." Winters stepped aside to allow her in, his mind racing. What could possibly have driven Mercy, the sweet, beautiful young woman known for her hospitality, to seek him out at such an hour? Mercy wasted no time. The moment she sat down, her confession began. Over the next 3 hours, Winters listened as Mercy spoke the words that would unravel the entire mystery. The confession was chilling, a story of calculated cruelty, of religious fervor twisted into justification for murder. Mercy explained that her family had been systematically murdering travelers for over 8 years. But what made her revelation truly horrifying was the cold, clinical nature of the murders, how they had been carried out with military precision, disguised as acts of charity. "It wasn't random," she said, her voice trembling as the weight of her words seemed to crush her. "It was all planned. It was all for a purpose, something that my father believed in. He said we were doing God's work." Mercy's story unfolded in horrifying detail. According to her, Ezekiel Harden, the patriarch of the family, had convinced his wife and children that they were chosen by God to carry out divine justice on the souls of those who traveled the wilderness roads. But this was no ordinary judgment. Ezekiel believed that the travelers they killed were sinners unworthy of life, and so they had been chosen for execution. The process began with a simple evaluation of the travelers, Mercy explained. Ezekiel would engage them in conversation, asking questions about their families, their beliefs, and their reasons for traveling. If they passed his moral test, they were allowed to continue on their way. But if they didn't meet his standards, if they were deemed to be unworthy, Ezekiel would pronounce them guilty. The family, always welcoming and kind to those in need, would then invite the condemned traveler to stay the night at their farm. The travelers, tired from their long journey, often saw the Hardens' generosity as a blessing and accepted the invitation with gratitude. They had no idea what was waiting for them behind the warm fires and comforting meals. Temperance Harden, Mercy's mother, had perfected a mixture of herbs that would make the victims drowsy. The drugged travelers would fall into a deep sleep, allowing the family to bind and restrain them without struggle. Once the victims were incapacitated, they were taken to the family's underground chambers, an extensive, hidden network of tunnels and rooms that Ezekiel had built beneath their farm. It was in these underground chambers that the murders took place. Ezekiel had created a twisted courtroom, where he would judge the travelers and decide their fate. The trials were mockeries, a grotesque parody of real justice, with Ezekiel acting as both judge and executioner. He would present evidence of the victims' supposed sins, and the family would carry out the sentence. Some were hanged, some were drowned in the underground water system, and others were forced to suffer until they finally succumbed to their fates. Mercy explained the family's methodical approach to the killings. There was no rush. Each victim was kept alive for as long as the family needed them. Some, like Dr. Marcus Cromwell, were kept alive long enough to provide medical services or perform other tasks, such as writing letters or sermons. Ezekiel had even made use of Cromwell's medical expertise to learn advanced techniques. But once they had outlived their usefulness, the victims were executed. Mercy spoke with disgust as she recalled her role in the operation. She had been forced to act as the family's record keeper, documenting every victim's name, appearance, and possessions. Her careful handwriting filled countless ledgers, cataloging the family's gruesome inventory of victims. She described the sense of pride her father took in the operation, believing that they were purging the world of unworthy souls. The family had grown more and more confident as their methods became perfected, moving from one location to the next whenever suspicion started to rise. Ezekiel, Temperance, Caleb, and Josiah had all been complicit in the murders. Even Mercy, who had initially been reluctant to participate, had become a part of the system, though she never lost her sense of horror at what they were doing. The final revelation came when Mercy confessed that there were still victims in the underground chambers. The family had captured William Patterson, a traveling surveyor, just days earlier. He was scheduled for trial the following night, and his fate was sealed. Mercy had been terrified for her own life, fearing that she too would eventually become a victim of her father's twisted judgment. The family had grown more paranoid as their operation continued, and Mercy knew that anyone who might pose a threat to their secrecy was now considered guilty in Ezekiel's eyes. It was this terror, fear for her own survival, that had driven Mercy to confess. She knew that the next victim could be her. As she finished her confession, Mercy collapsed into tears, begging Winters to stop the madness before more innocent lives were lost. The weight of her actions, the blood on her hands, seemed unbearable. But in that moment, she offered the one thing that Winters had needed all along: the truth. The revelation of the Harden family's crimes sent shockwaves through Millfield, through Kentucky, and throughout the frontier. What had once been a tight-knit community of respectful, devout people now found itself confronted with the horrifying reality that a beloved family had been systematically murdering innocent travelers for years. The depth of the betrayal was nearly impossible to comprehend, and the aftermath of Mercy Harden's confession would be felt for generations. Winters, now armed with Mercy's testimony, wasted no time in organizing a rescue operation. With the help of a few trusted individuals, Henrik Johansson, the Swedish immigrant known for his exceptional tracking skills, Isaac Brewster, the traveling peddler who had gathered information on the Harden family's past, and other townsfolk who had begun to suspect the Hardens, the constable made plans to raid the Harden farm. They knew that time was of the essence, for Mercy had revealed that there were still prisoners locked away in the family's underground chambers, and the Harden patriarch, Ezekiel, had become increasingly paranoid about their secrets being exposed. The operation was dangerous, and Winters knew that any confrontation with the Hardens would be fraught with peril. The family had fortified their home, turning their farm into a stronghold with hidden passages, secret exits, and a series of underground chambers that were nearly impossible to navigate. But Winters also knew that they had the element of surprise on their side. The Hardens were not expecting anyone to act, as they had always managed to evade suspicion by hiding behind their reputation for piety and good works. The raid on the Harden farm took place in the early hours of May 23, 1799. The group moved with stealth, staying close to the creek beds and tree lines to avoid detection. They reached the property under the cover of darkness, and as they approached the main house, the tension in the air was palpable. They could hear sounds from below, muffled voices, distant screams, and the unmistakable sound of tools scraping against stone. These were the noises that had haunted young Timothy Voren, the curious child who had first alerted Winters to the horrors taking place at the Harden farm. The cries were unmistakable, and they confirmed what Mercy had already confessed. The family was still holding victims in the underground chambers, and the screams were those of people who were suffering in unimaginable ways. When Winters and Johansson descended into the underground complex, they were met with a chilling sight. The chambers were far more extensive than anyone had imagined, stretching for nearly 200 yards beneath the farm. The walls were lined with stone, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. The courtroom, where Ezekiel had conducted his twisted trials, was a grotesque mockery of justice, complete with iron shackles embedded in the stone walls and religious symbols that had been perverted into tools of terror. The underground chambers were filled with evidence of the family's crimes: bones, discarded clothing, and personal belongings that had been taken from the victims. Among the wreckage, Winters and his team found dozens of ledgers, written in Mercy's careful handwriting, documenting the names and fates of the family's victims. It was a macabre record, a detailed inventory of human lives, catalogued as if they were mere objects to be used and discarded. The rescue operation was swift, but the discovery was far worse than anyone had anticipated. William Patterson, the traveling surveyor who had been captured just days before, was found alive, though weak and disoriented. He had been kept in one of the chambers, awaiting his trial, just as Mercy had described. Rebecca Foster, a young woman who had been missing for over a week, was found chained in another cell, her body showing signs of prolonged abuse. And Luther Grimby, an elderly preacher who had disappeared a month earlier, was found in the deepest part of the complex, barely alive, his health broken by weeks of captivity and psychological torment. The horrors didn't end with the prisoners. As the rescuers moved deeper into the chambers, they uncovered the full extent of the family's crimes. In one of the rooms, they discovered a collection of personal trophies, scalps, jewelry, and weapons that had been taken from the victims. The trophies were displayed with disturbing pride, a twisted shrine to the family's sense of superiority and power. But perhaps the most chilling discovery came when they found Ezekiel, Caleb, and Josiah in a nearby room, preparing for a final stand. The three men, armed and determined to fight to the death, had clearly anticipated this moment. Ezekiel, ever the preacher, ranted and raved about divine judgment, accusing Winters and his team of being agents of evil. Caleb and Josiah fought with desperation, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. The rescue party, led by Winters and Johansson, quickly overpowered them, capturing the men and ensuring that they could not escape. Meanwhile, Temperance Harden, who had been inside the main house, attempted to destroy evidence by setting fire to the building. The flames spread quickly through the dry timber, threatening to engulf the entire structure and destroy any remaining traces of the family's twisted operation. But before the fire could consume everything, the rescuers were able to extinguish the flames and secure the house, preventing the Hardens from covering their tracks any further. The aftermath of the raid was swift and brutal. The family members who had been arrested were brought to trial, and the evidence against them was overwhelming. Ezekiel Harden, the ringleader, was sentenced to death by hanging, as were his sons Caleb and Josiah. Temperance, though equally complicit, was spared the death penalty due to her apparent lack of direct involvement in the murders. She was instead sentenced to life imprisonment. Mercy, the youngest of the family, was given a lesser sentence due to her cooperation with the authorities, though she would spend the rest of her life in a Kentucky state penitentiary, haunted by the crimes she had witnessed and participated in. The execution of the Hardens took place on August 15, 1799, exactly 1 year after Samuel Fletcher's disappearance had set the investigation into motion. It was a day that would live in infamy, as over 4,000 people gathered to witness the public hanging of one of the most notorious families in American criminal history. The execution marked the end of the Harden family's reign of terror, but the legacy of their crimes would live on. The farm was burned to the ground, and the underground chambers were sealed, ensuring that the victims could finally rest in peace. Local authorities declared the land cursed, forbidding any future construction on the site. But the Harden family's story didn't end with their deaths. Their crimes would become a cautionary tale, one that served as a warning about the dangers of blind trust and the ease with which evil can disguise itself as righteousness. It also highlighted the need for better investigative practices, as the family had managed to evade detection for so long.